Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to try and make this as brief as possible because this is a long one, but it's totally worth it. And as a matter of fact, I've said a number of things here at the beginning about how I really don't know whether or not this is something I should continue to do. And while I really enjoy all the conversations and I feel like there's something that is valuable, in this one, when I was editing it, I thought, this is totally worth doing. I should really change my attitude. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to do a little announcement of a couple of changes here. I'm just going to keep changing things until I get it right. So, it's interesting because I had announced, the update to the Taiji Reality Substack and all that kind of thing. And for some reason, that episode, even though there's basically no content in it, has gotten a lot of listens, which I don't understand. But I guess people like short episodes. So it's too bad because it's really not reflective of what the podcast is about. And I wish I could make these shorter, but I can't. A conversation has its own natural arc, and you really kind of just have to follow that. So without much further ado, this is a joint podcast presentation on both the Assembly of Silence and Cryptosophy podcasts. Doyle Baxter, who you may recall was a guest a few episodes ago, invited me to join him for his relaunch of Cryptosophy. And this is truly a fascinating and intense ride. I hope you enjoy it. If you want to help out, it's pretty obvious what to do, but just in case you don't know, you can rate on iTunes. It's awesome if you would say something positive in a comment. It might even be awesome if you say something negative in a comment, because I think just the more comments, the better. It's sort of like there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? And if you want to support it, there's taijireality.substack.com and there's patreon.com/taijireality. Or you can send a little something as just a little tip to taijireality@gmail.com on PayPal. Or you can just spread the news. And I am going to encourage those of you who listen to at least submit your email to the taijireality.substack.com because, when you listen to this show, you might recognize that some things get said that might upset someone, and I really wouldn't be surprised if someday various platforms decide they just don't want any of this going on anymore. So it'd be nice to be able to stay in touch and continue to do this work, even if the lords of the interwebs decide they don't like us. You never know. So with that, here is the episode. And we're recording on this end.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for making the time to do another joint episode of the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour and the Cryptosophy podcast. As you know, this will be the inaugural relaunch of my activities on the Cryptosophy podcast. Just last week, my co-host Max Krieger uploaded the fourth installment of our Specialists series, and he interviewed a junior college baseball coach. And it was one of the most interesting conversations that you would never think to be interested in. Max has a really wonderful way of making even relatively innocuous sounding jobs of existential import, which really is the purpose of the Specialist show. And so it was a really fantastic relaunch. And I'm excited for this conversation as well, because I think that a lot of the themes that you and I teased out on our first conversation on your podcast maybe a couple of weeks ago, a month ago now. I think that will actually really provide a true kind of foundation, or at least some kind of level of familiarity with each other's views, that we can start to actually go deep on some of them.
Perfect.
So with that, I will give you just a second to introduce yourself, say hi, tell the world who you are and what you're doing.
Hello, world. Well, as Doyle mentioned, I have a podcast called the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour, where we have freewheeling discussions on primarily philosophical and spiritual issues, but it's pretty broad ranging. It can dip into politics or occasionally science, really whatever it is that comes up. And it's a range of different guests, people in different walks of life, many of whom aren't necessarily geared towards presenting themselves, but some are. And other activities include a number of philosophical concepts that I explore on a YouTube channel called Taiji Reality, TAIJIREALITY, and a Substack, taijireality.substack.com. Most of that kind of focuses on the ancient Chinese symbolic system referred to as the Bagua, which consists of trigrams that are the basis for the I Ching. So it's somewhat esoteric, although a lot of people are familiar with the I Ching at this point. So that kind of gives a thumbnail sketch of some of the things that I'm interested in. There's a couple other things going on, but that gives you a sense of what it is.
That's perfect. And, when we were texting over the Christmas holiday, and I think that this can be sort of the genesis for the conversation today, I, in a sort of offhanded way, in wishing you a belated Merry Christmas, said something along the lines of, well, I'm just disappointed that Christ didn't come back, but Merry Christmas. Hopefully this year is a little bit better. I'd love to just get like the thought that ran through your head when you read that text message.
Well, I guess one thing I was thinking, is that a perennial disappointment, or is it this particular year that you felt that there was a good chance that the second coming was about to occur?
I think typically it's perennial. Every year I get really excited for Christmas, and particularly really do try to embody the hope of the second coming. But this year in particular just seemed like so apt for it, right? It's like we have all of the things that you would expect potentially would expect in like a pre-apocalyptic sort of epoch. There's the decadence of society, a pandemic, rumors of wars, political not uprising is the wrong word, but political
upheaval,
discord. Upheaval is perhaps a better word. And then to top it all off, we had the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter on the 21st of December, which, of course, from a symbolic perspective is a really interesting thing. Every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn get really close in the sky, but they have not been this close in the sky since the 1600s. And it's ostensibly the first time in modern human history that it's occurred on the same day as the winter solstice. And the interesting thing that brings together kind of the mythological naming of those planets, the cosmological realities that we're actually witnessing, and then like in the context of a Christianity, is that Saturn and Jupiter represent the two of the generations of the Greek and Roman gods.
Yeah.
And Christ is ostensibly the Son of God, and therefore is the third in this kind of triumvirate, or at least this third in line of these great the kings of the gods, right? Starting with Saturn, and then his son Jupiter, and then ostensibly his son Jesus, right? And so I thought that it would just have been an intriguing year from a poetic justice sort of perspective for the return to actually take place.
Is there some other reason why Christmas would be thought of as the time for the arrival?
Well, Christmas is celebrated when it is precisely because of the winter solstice. I think biblical scholars are more or less aligned in the thinking that, based on the activities of the shepherds that are described in the Gospels, that it's most likely that Christ, or that narrative, took place in the springtime, not in the dead of winter. And so the question is, well, why do we celebrate Christmas when we do? And I think part of it is Christianity's perhaps unique ability to graft on to the underlying cultural, religious, and other social things, and graft onto them and repurpose them. And so December 25th is simply it's just a few days off, a few days of a miscalculation, essentially, of what would have been a winter solstice feast, probably in the Nordic countries.
So it's not only grafting onto to cultural phenomena, but it's grafting onto the actual mechanics of the solar system.
Precisely. And it would make sense that the celebration of the birth of the Savior, who is the light in the darkness, would emerge on the day that is the darkest day of the year, right? With the shortest day of the year is the darkest day of the year. And so it's like symbolically, that's when the hero would emerge, the Savior.
That's right. Yeah. So it's interesting also that this year, this conjunction occurred at the beginning of Aquarius. One of the other things that I am interested in, which might provoke some interesting conversation, is what is commonly called astrology, even though I think that's a terrible term for it. And Aquarius has a fascinating set of associations, one of which is interconnectedness, kind of universality, a sense of an understanding that the interactions that are happening are kind of universal in scale, and that the creation is a gigantic dance of all these different perspectives. And so it's this kind of, you could say, globalist type of view. I think globalist is a kind of a earth-bound way of expressing it. And I think it might be more universalist, but, using the word globalist, I think, has a resonance with what's happening now politically, because, well, what's been happening here on planet Earth with respect to human interaction is increasingly something that is global in nature. And we see that right now with respect to the pandemic, and with respect to the way that all of the world's economies are interlaced, and how, events in remote parts of the world are having an effect around the entire globe now.
And how precisely does Aquarius sort of like mediate over the universalism or the globalism? Is he the harbinger of that, or somebody that would stand in opposition to that?
Well, a real discussion of this would require an explanation of the signs, which may or may not be something you'd want to do right now. But I think that for the purposes of, we could just do this for a moment if you want. I think you'll find it incredibly interesting. So I'll share my screen with you right now so you can actually see the configuration at the time of, and it's a pity that we're not recording the video, but you can see the configuration at, this would be on the solstice. So here we have Jupiter and Saturn right here at the beginning of Aquarius. And the way that I talk about, because fundamentally the problem that I have with the word astrology is that there's this idea that these signs are somehow associated with the constellations. And, astrology means the study of the stars. But from my point of view, this has nothing to do with the stars. The stars were just a way of being able to get a sense of where you were within an annual cycle. Are you seeing what I've got up on the screen?
I am seeing it. Yeah, and that's totally true. Right? The constellations are fixed, so to speak, and it's the planets that move freely semi-freely among them. And
so right here is the interface that describes the vernal equinox. And this is really where the astrological chart is defined. So the beginning of Aries is the vernal equinox, which is in essence the beginning of a new year, which is why this has to do with new things coming into being. So I'll very quickly run through this so you can get a sense of the overall perspective. When new things come into being, they need to find a solid place to land. So Aries is the new thing coming into being. And then the Taurus is like a fertile place for this new thing to find rest. It needs to find a foundation where it can germinate. And that's what Gemini is about. And you see it's a split. The twins are joined together. And that's because when something germinates, it's heading in two opposite directions, and yet it's one thing. So a seed, when it germinates, part of it is reaching up towards the sun, part of it is digging down into the earth. It's one thing, but it's doing two very opposite things. And that's the basic engine of life. In order for it to develop, it has to develop a relationship with its environment, which is what Cancer is about, which is sort of like nurturing the give and take of a living thing in its environment. And if it's successful at doing that, then it can have a sense of self, a sense of being, which is what Leo is. And from that sense of being, it can work its prerogative in the world around it. Virgo is sort of like organizing and analyzing. So it will try to set things up to serve itself, to serve the thing that it just built, and to serve its own sense of self. And if it's capable of setting things up to serve itself, it's then able to come into equilibrium with its environment, which is what Libra's about. And if it's able to find that balance, then it can look beyond itself. So it's sort of like Maslow hierarchy of needs. If you take care of the basics, then you can look beyond the self, which is what Scorpio is about, perceiving the other. And in perceiving the other, you can get a deeper sense of understanding, which is what Sagittarius is. And that deeper sense of understanding gives one a better sense of what your purpose is, which is what Capricorn is about. And having fulfilling a sense of purpose gives one a sense of the interconnectedness of all things. All things are trying to fulfill their purpose, which is what Aquarius is. And in that sense of the interconnectedness of all things, one is able to relinquish the self so that something new can come into being. So relinquishing the self is what Pisces is, which is why Christ is associated with Pisces, the Piscean age. And that's what makes way for a new thing to come into being. And so in some ways, that provides a really interesting context for the idea of the second coming, because in a certain sense, what's suggested by this way of looking at things is that it is that fundamental self-sacrifice, the understanding that you need to be able to relinquish in order for the new age to come, that characterizes, you could say, the Christic embodiment. Is that all make some sense, or is that a little too far out there?
No, I mean, it's definitely making sense to me symbolically too. And sorry, the one thing I missed there was Aquarius, particularly his role in that process again.
So Aquarius is sort of like when one has an understanding of things, having appreciated the other, Scorpio, and then deepened your understanding, Sagittarius, then one is able to fulfill your true purpose. And in fulfilling true purpose, you see that, well, this basis of this sort of second half of the wheel, the appreciation of the other in Scorpio, that there are others who are also finding their understanding and developing their sense of purpose. And so you're able to see this kind of dance of all things trying to fulfill their purpose, which is what I'm saying Aquarius is about. So it's sort of that global universalist view of this crazy dance that has some rather problematic, difficult, horrific aspects to it, but at the same time has these glorious, unbelievably beautiful aspects to it. And you're seeing it all as one gigantic kind of flow of being, if you like.
Fascinating. So in Aquarius, you actually come to recognize that this cycle is what's being perpetrated by all being outside. And that actually paves the way for the subsequent giving up of oneself and then the subsequent emergence of new life from that. And so there's a moment of in Aquarius, there's a moment of recognition that the other is not so other, and therefore I can sacrifice myself for them. Is that kind of what you're saying? Interesting.
Precisely. And that the divine spark is within all of us, and that is eternal. And so we don't have to worry about like preserving this life, which is short no matter what you do. What we're really doing is fulfilling our purpose, regardless of whether or not it keeps our particular soul in existence. That would be sort of the Leo concern of maintaining this self.
One of the things I find so interesting about this model of kind of comprehending the universe is that and I might say something that's out there, and so I might have to backtrack. So just prepping my potential need to backtrack on this statement. But it seems to me that this is fundamentally not a Western way of looking at the world, but rather it's something precisely other than that. And I think that insofar as we call it the second coming of Christ and not necessarily the recoming of Christ or something like that, it's actually a signal that there was something that was once and now it is again, and it won't be forever, and perhaps a rejection of the cyclical nature of things. To develop that thought a little bit further, I think specifically, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the relationship between the second coming, our sort of notions of eschatology, and sort of the ethics that are built on hope of this second coming. It's like there's an acknowledgement of what will be is not today. And it's as an object of hope that I can construct a life around what could be tomorrow and live today as if that tomorrow will come. That seems to me to be a little bit different than this conception of the universe, because this would say already that this cycle is evidenced in nature, and my job is to kind of enter in to this, for the self to disappear into nature, as opposed to what I would construe as the fundamentally Western position, as the self's almost attempted negation at nature itself, and its attempt, and the individual's need or kind of existential desire to distance itself and to make a self of itself, rather than recede into the quasi nothingness that is all being.
Yeah, I don't think that that's necessarily implied by this system. I would say that one way of looking at this is the development of the individual self into the, you might say, divine self, or something which is aligned with the divine self in some way or another, so that the emergence of the greater sense of self is the fundamental feature of it, and the attachment to the particulars of the material world are lessened as you kind of gain understanding and see, perceive the reality of the natural world, which is in some way something you're leaving behind towards the end of the cycle. Well, which you are definitely leaving behind at the end of the cycle. But I would say that, from an Aquarian sensibility, you're actually sort of standing back from the pageantry of it all and, perhaps appreciating it, perhaps also to some extent lessening your ties to it, having a sense of, well, I've played my role and I will see it to its fulfillment. But ultimately, I will have to relinquish my position so that something new can come into being.
Yeah, certainly. Interesting. So to bring us back a little bit to specifically the notions of the second coming, as almost like as an impetus towards like an ethical life, I'm curious, even insofar as, we pray for the second coming in the Our Father every time we pray it, Thy kingdom come. We might not know that that's what we're really praying for, right, but it's there embedded in a prayer that's, perhaps whispered by billions of people around the world every day.
On earth.
On earth. Yeah, indeed.
On earth as it is in heaven. So that sort of describes the eschatology, doesn't it? I mean, that is the goal, ideally, right?
Precisely, in that it's not something that is, it's not so far off that we can't conceptualize it already in the way that we already live and move and have our being in the world. It's precisely that life set free from all of the negative consequences that happen to seem to be necessary for life to exist. Joseph Campbell talks about one of the first things that life notices once its eyes open is that life is a very tragic thing, because for life to continue to propagate, it has to kill and eat other life. And so one of the promises of a second coming, of thy kingdom come, is precisely all of the miracles and joys of life without what are today its necessary tragic elements and the killing and the eating of other life.
So the lion will lie down with the lamb, right?
Precisely. So another kind of thing that I have been thinking about in relation to into the second coming, and this is going to seem really far out there, but I think it might be an interesting prompt for a conversation. It seems to me that of all of the political ideologies that we've seen recently, the Marxists actually seem to have the best understanding of what the second coming could be like. And that seems like a very interesting statement, given the atheistic alignment of Marxism by necessity. But even the use of the word like eschatological Marxism is a thing, right? And so I have some thoughts around like why it could be the case that the Marxists understand better than everybody else what the second coming could mean.
Great, let's hear it.
But I want to caveat this with my particular. I'm both reaching the ends of my erudition, things that I've studied, and the ends of my ability to like think and imagine. So it's like I'm truly at the boundary line of things that I know, or things that I don't know that I don't know. So I'll just preface that with this. I don't know if you're familiar with a thinker by the name of Alain Badiou. He is a French thinker, a materialist, and he's still alive today, in fact. He wrote the first of his great magnum opuses in 1988, and the title of the book was called Being and Event. And Badiou is a really interesting character because he's a self-avowed Maoist. Wow. And I'm just gonna say I don't know the difference between real Maoism and real Marxism, so I'm just gonna plead some ignorance there. But one of the things that Badiou's philosophy does, he does two things critically at the outset of his philosophy that are fascinating. The first is that he declares that the study of being qua being, right, ontology itself, is nothing more than the mathematics of set theory, which is to say that he's Cartesian at a fundamental level. All being can be described in mathematical language. Being does not contain mystery. Being, precisely the opposite, is the pure inconsistent multiple that can be described with the language of set theory, which allows for various kinds of infinities that are bigger than infinity itself. The second thing that he does is he withdraws philosophy from the task of truth making. And he says rather that truth making is embedded within 4 truth procedures that are not philosophical. And those 4 truth procedures are politics, science, art, and love. And then he, kind of setting that stage, defines truth in a way that is precisely not ontological. It's not the same thing that you describe with the mathematics of set theory. In fact, truth is something that can't be described by ontology. Truth is something of a non-being, because there's something undecidable about truth. Because where truth really emerges is the happening of an event, and then the fidelity of the subjects that are witness to that event, staying faithful to it across time. So that all sounds abstract. What he's really done is he's taken the notion of the revolution as kind of an abstract concept, the political revolution, and he's turned it into this thing called an event, and determined that what truth is it's the same kind of thing that happens when the Revolutionary Army forgets not the thing that set them on their revolt and actually instantiated a new situation in history. What happens, though, at this point, once you have truths that are not ontological, but rather the result of fidelity of subjects to events, I think you actually come to understand something really interesting about Christianity. And Badiou points this out himself. He says that St. Paul is precisely the first person to understand the militant nature of truth. Precisely not the, it's not about erudition or study or logical investigation. Truth is the decision of the subject to remain faithful to an event, and an event that perhaps that subject didn't even necessarily witness, right? As a Christian, I was not there when Christ was walking on the earth. I did not hear him preach. I did not see him die on the cross or rise from the dead. And yet it's the fidelity to this event that actually reconstitutes truths by which I can build a new situation, which is like my life. And so Badiou is precisely not your traditional dialectical materialist or your democratic materialist, because he has this more robust notion of the event, which is not, again, it's not ontological. It's like an emergence in history. And it allows him to not lose the eschatological hope of all communists, right? Which is essentially the coming of the kingdom.
Right.
And so as a result, I find that Badiou's, the way that he thinks about reality, and especially when you think about events that are not precisely political ones, like if you abstract event from revolution and then start to think through all of history in terms of Badiou's notion of the event, it actually turns out to be perhaps one of the most accurate descriptors of the way that history actually unfolds in reality. And so I can't help but feel a little bit convinced that his understanding of the nature of things underneath is right in some sense.
Well, it's interesting. So you're outlining a way of thinking that I'm not that familiar with. So we may have to kind of go over it a few times in order to really discuss it. It strikes me that, in essence, what he's doing is he's saying that truth is a decision that's made by each individual on the basis of some particular event, and that it's not a inherent property of any given aspect of being. That seems to me problematic, because although we may not be able to discern what the truth is of being, there is some fundamental truth to being itself. And you can think of that in a how would we say? You could think of that as being both an artifact of consciousness and of the phenomena that consciousness observes, because clearly things are happening in a particular way. So you can say that there are true statements that can be made about what it is that's occurring. And, I think when you come to the sciences, perhaps is the domain within which that's the most apparent. We're you're making an effort in science to figure out, well, yes, there is a definite thing occurring, and what is the truth of that phenomena? Can we come up with some way of being able to get close to describing? When you say describe, you're not actually like grasping the thing being described. So you can posit that there is an actual truth about the things that are occurring, even though our descriptions are always going to be kind of dancing around it. So I have some problems with that way of formulating things if I'm understanding it correctly, because I think that there is a truth to the way phenomena occurs, and there is also a truth to the nature of being, which is the thing, the spirit within us. There are truths, real truths there, and it's not just a matter of making a decision about a particular event. So I would argue with it. Am I making an argument that makes sense in relation to that? Because I'm not sure if I caught all of it.
You are, and I think that this is fundamentally the point where if you're gonna disagree with Badiou and some of his successors and heirs, you have to win this argument about the nature of being, because once being, or shall we say, once the study of being is mathematical, then it's something that is now transparent to human thought entirely, because it's human thought that's capable of generating a language with which to describe all of reality in its fullness, even in its complexity. And that's the key thing. It's we don't necessarily need to go into all of the details of like transfinite math that lives in set theory and thus is like kind of embedded in Badiou's philosophy, but essentially it allows for the rigorous and comprehensive study of things that are so massive that infinity is not even big enough to pull them together, right? They are transfinite. They are bigger than infinite.
Sorry to interrupt, but just briefly, there's an interesting documentary that I think is called something along the lines of Dangerous Ideas, something along the, I'll have to look it up. But in essence, it traces the history of the concept of infinity and talks about some of the key mathematical minds who work with these ideas. And I think in 3 out of 4 cases, they all went mad thinking about it, like literally drove themselves nuts. So infinity is a highly speculative, problematic. I mean, mathematics, yes, it's an incredible capacity within humanity to find a descriptive language that's so rigorous, and yet at the same time, it's really not entirely clear that mathematical formulations are in any way tied to ontological reality. I mean, there are some which seem to do a pretty decent job, but on the other hand, there's an awful lot of mathematical conceptualizing that we don't have a lot of evidence as to whether or not there is a real referent in either phenomena or being. So, my sense of it is that the lack is always going to be on the part of our effort to describe. And so I guess I would disagree to some extent with what you just said, because it seems to me that while we have achieved some remarkable things in our ability to tease out an understanding of things, that understanding is always fundamentally limited, and that we're constantly kind of bumping up against the various inconsistencies in our models. And, we can tinker with them and fine tune them. But my sense is that as we do so, some of the assumptions that we made at the beginning are going to cause the system to fundamentally be irrelevant as the universe goes on changing. So I don't know that we can ever really get a grasp on it, but I don't think that that's a reason to say that there is no actual truth to the phenomenological or world of being.
So it's intriguing that this is the line of objection you're taking to the underlying philosophy, because Badiou would reply with something like, the emergence of transfinite math, namely by the work of Georg Cantor, was itself an event that I, as a subject, as a philosopher, have cast my fidelity to. Right. And so it's
great. Cantor was one of the guys who drove himself nuts thinking about infinities.
Exactly. Yeah, he is. But his import on Western philosophy, at least since Badiou's writing about him in 1988, and since then, has been pretty remarkable, because it seems to me that there isn't a better way of reconciling what I would otherwise call unreconcilable differences between what Marxism / communism / Maoism actually, says, and then the things that it does, right? Because in doing this, Badiou has actually found a way to remain a Maoist or a communist, to reconcile the unreconcilable in communism and Marxism, which is namely that every time it's ever been tried, it's resulted in horror on the scale that you can't even really imagine, right? Like, you can't really imagine what tens of millions of dead people means, or hundreds of millions of dead people means.
Right.
And what he seems to have, found is, at the heart of it, a way of dealing with the apparently unjustifiable notions of the death and the suffering and all of these things, with a true something to be hoped for, an eschaton that is actually justifying for all of the pain and suffering that leads up to it.
Well, this gets to an incredibly difficult issue that I guess we really have to discuss, because you have this, the wheat and the chaff notion, that there's the threshing floor, and that at some point or another there is this separation between, those who are fit for, let's say, the kingdom of heaven, and those who are not. And then the fundamental question is really whether or not the ones who are fit for heaven remain here on earth or not. One way of viewing it is that in these crucial moments, the right will prevail and continue here to exist on planet Earth. And another way of viewing it is, well, actually, no. In some ways, maybe Christ was telling us quite the opposite, that you don't live for this planet. What you live is for something far higher, a greater ideal, and that the ones who depart are the ones who are preserving what is good, while those who remain are going to fight out for the scraps remaining, and suffer these horrible episodes of history. Now, I don't know that I believe one way or the other. I think both of them are plausible. We would like to believe that the righteous would prevail here on earth, but it does seem that, while you can perhaps find a philosophical way to justify the horrors of the Stalinist and Maoist periods, and certainly, we can't just lay all of that on the communists. There have been plenty of horrors committed by really all ideologies. I mean, I think the problematic is kind of laid out right there. It's certainly possible that life on Earth is a proving ground where, on some fundamental level, we're being asked to accept that this is not the prime issue, that just material existence is insufficient to a good life, and that, ideally one would be able to integrate spiritual being with physical presence. But in some ways, you could say that one of the things that St. Paul really highlights is the incredible difficulty that occurs when you're trying to realize that marriage.
Right. Right. Well, and it kind of goes without saying too, like that there's a fundamental assent of faith of some kind, whether it's the kind of faith that Badiou talks about in the fidelity to the event, or just the assent that like the tragic nature of existence and the eventual redemption of the righteous is something that's worth happening, right? You could take a what you might call like a cynical view of things, that it's like, why would I even care to participate in an eternal life that rewards me for my righteousness if the price for that in some sense is the senseless horror and death of life itself, right? And I think that even there, like there's at some point there has to be a decision that grounds any sort of ethics, or any sort of ethics that would be built upon some notion of hope, whether it's like the eschatological Marxist hope or the salvific hope of Christianity, or yet something else.
To what extent could we say that the eschatological hope of the communist impulse has in any way been realized?
It hasn't.
That's the thing, right? So, I mean, you can justify this for a vision. I mean, how many horrors have happened in the name of some concept of utopia? This is, I think, hubris, really. The idea that we can bring heaven on earth. I mean, to some extent, perhaps we can get out of the way by stop trying to create it. That would be my sense of it. We could get out of the way of God's purpose by stop trying to assert our own idea, because we're not the creators. We are the transformers. My sense is that originally we were here to be the caretakers, and somewhere along the way we forgot and developed a sense of probably because we became so infatuated with survival. It's not an easy thing to do quite often, and so incredibly difficult things are done in order to maintain a presence in this world. And that creates some tough characters with, and you could say in some ways a lot of the ideas of the warrior. It's a mixed bag, that we can prevail. We can assert ourselves in the world, and we can make this world into what we want it to be. So the exercising of power, the aggregation of power in human hands is something which is just profoundly dangerous. And yet at the same time, it's completely understandable. I mean, this is basically what's required in order to compete with the civilizations that have embraced power and asserting power. So on a certain level, we don't really have a choice if we're going to be a participant here on Earth. But again, it comes back to this thing of, living for the kingdom of heaven and not for the things of this earth. That's what we're being asked to do on some fundamental level. But it's incredibly painful, very difficult. It's no wonder that even back in the day, they were having such a hard time trying to find the way. How do we live by these truths, right, that this event revealed to us? Is that a fair way of kind of tying it together?
Precisely. Well, and it's that fundamental question that I think lives at the heart of everything. Because I've read it so many times and love it so much, I have an annoying way of tying everything back to the Iliad. But I think in this case, like it's actually originary in that, what Achilles decides in the Iliad, and so does Hector and the rest of them, is that immortality in recognition, in honor, is actually better than living a long, peaceful life where nobody remembers you. And this is why I think why when we were talking about the star sign stuff earlier, I asked the question of like, yeah, but is this the mode of understanding that actually lives at sort of like the originary root of Western culture? Because it would seem to me that actually it's the decision that Achilles and Hector and the rest of these folks make, this tragic, horrible, awful decision that like, yeah, I'm going to die and like all my family is going to get killed. And, my city of Troy is going to get razed to the ground. But guess what? Several thousand years from now, there will be some guys having a podcast and they're going to say the glorious name of Hector aloud. Right. And so this is what I want to make sure that I don't know that I was clear earlier, is that I'm not justifying the Marxist position. I actually find it abhorrent. However, I think that it's almost a logical necessity if you view the originary founding of the West in the literature of the Iliad, because like that the essence of humanity that's shown there seems to find its logical
willingness to do terrible deeds.
Exactly.
The willingness to do terrible deeds under the, let's say, I'm trying to find a word that doesn't quite shade it the way I normally would. The willingness to do terrible deeds under the transfixion of a particular event. So, a particular truth that's derived from a particular event, something along those lines.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think that what this means is I don't know exactly what it means, right? Like I said, I'm sort of at the end of both my erudition and my thinking.
I think we are way out on the ledge here. It's an interesting place to be, because it's like there's so much to come to terms with, and at the same time you feel like I'm really not sure where we are or what. But as far as the Western tradition goes, I would say that if you think about the Song of Solomon, all is vanity. There is a Western tradition that does transcend the concept of this terrible deeds must be done for noble purposes, right? And there is also, I think, integrated into that, the concept of hubris is huge. And I think it's kind of ignored in some respects. We tend to lionize these great heroic figures without understanding that quite often they were lessons in the consequences. You have Icarus, you have Prometheus, both of which were reaching for something beyond themselves in a grand sense and out of some noble sense of purpose. And yet at the same time, tragedy befell them. And so, where is humility in all this? That was considered one of the great Christian virtues, right? And Christ himself at the time of his life was a very humble person. At the same time, he had greatness in a way that transcended the greatness of Caesar. You know what I mean? So there's a real dialectic here within humanity of these two perspectives on what is the great life, what is the true life of purpose. And I would advocate, I think just because it's rarely advocated for, it's not as if there isn't a part of me that appreciates this heroic sense of purpose, but I would advocate for this humble sense of purpose as being perhaps far greater, and that it is actually elementally part of the Western tradition. And parenthetically, the system that I showed you is more affiliated with the Western tradition of so-called astrology than, there are other systems there are a lot of overlaps, but that are more definitely associated with, for instance, the Chinese system is actually quite different, and the Vedic system is related but different. It actually might more reasonably be called astrology because they do sidereal calculations, which actually do align with the stars. But, the Western system, which is sort of what this is referred to as the tropical projection, I think is what they call it, the tropical horoscope, is based on Earth patterns, as far as and that's how I see it, at least. And it is pretty much part of the Western tradition. So there is kind of an esoteric adjunct to the Western tradition that I think embraces a lot of these ideas.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you use the word dialectic, like it's almost like there's a dialectic within the root of the human spirit. And there's two choices, and it's the two choices that you just outlined. There's the will to power, which is, more or less like a good summary umbrella term for everything that we've just discussed with regards to all the way back to the Greek heroes that were fighting at Troy, all the way up to, the deeds of the Revolutionary Army and the establishment of the communist state, right? Like all of that falls on the one side. And then on the other side is this almost like will to self-negation, which is absolutely present in Christ to the point of the free acceptance of death, right?
I would characterize that a little differently, because I think that when Christ is talking about I and the Father are one, it's really not self-abnegation. It's recognition of the divine self. There is throughout the ancient world a thread of thinking that basically says that we are all the same self. That God is fundamentally, Patanjali calls it, the universal yet particular indweller. So you can say that on some fundamental level, from that perspective, the individual self is the illusion. And the reality is that kind of Aquarian sensibility that this is all God interacting within one grand self. And so you're not really abnegating the self. You're actually connecting to the great self, the capital S self, instead of being trapped in your own individual isolated sense of being. Actually, there's a greater way of putting it, because existence is a word that actually means outside of self. So to exist is to not be connected with the self, to feel separate from the great self, to feel separate from the Father, right? And being, which is ist, is that ground that is connected to the totality, to the eternal, if you like.
This is precisely it. What I used what I called the will to power as that umbrella term is perhaps it's better. It's the will to istance, right? Whether that's existence or resistance or persistence or subsistence. It's absolutely, well, it's not precisely a will to being, which is what I would say you're characterizing as not self-abnegation, but like affirmation of a different notion of self that sits at the heart of the human person and presents us with this dialectic, these two options of the way to live one's life, kind of, exemplified on perhaps, the two extremes. Like on the one hand, you have like the Cincinnatus character of Roman history, who is called forth to be the great dictator to save the state. And then after he does so, he goes back to his farm to tend to his corn and donkeys, right? And then on the other hand is, the Caesar character, who does the same thing, is, to save the state from itself, is made the great dictator and makes his reign a dictatorship for life and brings the crashing down of the Republic into, what is essentially becomes Caesar's empire for the rest of Roman history.
Right. And does so on the basis of a kind of populism.
Absolutely. Caesar was the people's man.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
So here's the question for me. I think that we're very close to uncovering some really interesting things. One of the things that I have always read into the Nicene Creed, the Christian creed, that's our symbol. It's the definition of a Christian. If you don't proclaim this creed out loud, by definition, you're not a Christian. And one of its ending lines is, "I believe in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come." And I've always been very intrigued by the relationship between this affirmation, this assent, and what I would call a truism in Christianity, which is that God does not help those who do not help themselves. Right? It is not a Christian notion that to get a good grade on a test, I should pray for a good grade on the test. Rather, if I want God to help me get a good grade on the test, I should pray that I study well and then go study. And then I get the test. And then I get to take the test and get a good grade. And so I have been playing with, and I think it's been for a couple of years now, really since I met the ideas of Badiou and one of his successors, whose name is Meillassoux. I've been thinking about the relationship between the will to existence sort of root of humanity that seems to go all the way back to the time of the literature of Homer, and this notion, this affirmation in the creed that is the future to which the future that we believe in, and then trying to figure out how does that fit in with this notion of, well, God doesn't help those that help themselves. And so is the Eschaton and the arrival of the kingdom where all of the dead are risen together and live in an eternal world of justice, is that something that you wait around for? Or is that something that you actually have to work for in order for the advent of that world to be worthwhile?
Right. That's fascinating subtlety there.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is where I want to agree with you that the answer is to choose the way of the capital S self. But I also can't, yes. I want that to be the answer. But with respect to the things I've just discussed, I can't see how the more of the will to power side is actually how you get to the final object of the hope of Christianity.
It seems that the defining line is wherever hubris begins. So to the extent that one is involved in the project with the sense of the small s self, the individual self, as the subject of grandeur, that seems like the slippery slope to hell. Whereas if one is able to participate in the world and maintain the sense of God as being the real self, and that the true purpose is to fulfill the will of heaven, not to fulfill Caesar's will, well, maybe that would be a way of delineating the favored approach.
And so so that's really interesting, because what now seems to be the case is that the actions that both sides take are the same, and what matters is actually the motivations.
I don't think that the motivations could produce the same actions. I think that the actions will degenerate on the basis of hubris.
Okay, interesting. So the will to existence pursued to its logical ends gives us the strong man, who is the God on earth and the God of our supposedly eschatological state, right? That's your Stalin. And right. Because that's actually what's at the root of the motivations. And so even though they are aiming in the same direction, the net result of it is actually they're not even comparable, because on the one hand you have the communist state with a dictator, and on the other hand you actually maybe achieve it by making the strong man not a man, but by making him God, you actually achieve the ends that the communist state was trying to get at in the first place.
Well, we have another terrible truth to consider here, which is the idea that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it's easy to speculate here on what the noble man might do placed in a given circumstance. But it does seem that the tendency that's extraordinarily difficult to resist is that that corruption will overtake one once you're in the position to start doing things on that level. So that's another kind of fly in the ointment, if you like.
It's almost like we're doomed to a Sisyphean. How do you say that? Sisyphean or Sisyphean game?
I think it's Sisyphean, but I don't really know.
Yeah, where we're just rolling this stone up, and at the end, well, but that's the thing, and this is what I think maybe makes Christianity so unique, is that it's claimed that no, the guy, he was here, he actually came. His name was Jesus. He was
Right.
born in Palestine in the year 0, and he's going to come back.
Well, note the nature of his time here. At no point did he assume the reins of power. He was tempted by the devil to be given that, right? So he could have ascended to Caesar's throne, but he didn't.
And thereby would have probably been the same as Stalin on the throne.
On some level, because the office is what determines the person in many respects. So it's the question that arises is, can it be different at some point? And there's no doubt that conditions here on Earth are changing, and what may have in the past seemed to be a fait accompli, something that would just naturally result from a given political circumstance or something like that, may no longer be the case, because the level of technological power and control, and the degree to which it's changing not only human life, but just the face of the planet, really. This is going to be a radical transformation. And I'm not saying that the fundamental dynamics aren't going to, on some level, remain the same, but there may be ways in which, for instance, the people who are running these tech platforms, they really, in many respects, are the masters of the world right now. And they've gotten there not by killing people. So it hasn't required the same kind of brutality and heroic action. It's required a kind of ruthless intelligence. And we can imagine that things will play out somewhat differently now if these are the people who are running the show. Now, that's not to say that there isn't hubris involved there, but it's of a slightly different nature than someone like Stalin. Hopefully it will remain of a different nature. We will find out.
Well, if we're going to build an ethics of hope, we should hope for that thing.
Well, the one thing that's wonderful about the tech world is that it really does thrive on a kind of playful, innovative approach, and it has a kind of how shall we put it? In its development, there's a continual search for something new, and an effort at a deeper understanding of not only the systems, but the people who are interacting with the systems. And so it seems that if you're going to study something, understanding and innovation is better than the kind of ruthless political machinations and military operations that characterized power in the past. I think that the political dimension of it is becoming rather ruthless with respect to the text, but so far, not as much blood has been shed. So maybe that is somewhat of a harbinger of the world to come, for better or worse.
One of the things that just strikes me as a reality at this point is that regardless of the way that it manifests itself, it seems to me that a real sort of politics of egalitarianism doesn't seem very tenable, because even in, kind of liberalism with a small L that runs the West today, there is fundamentally, it's not democracy at all. It's like, it is an oligarchy, and it is on its face, like, that is the benefit of it, is that it's an oligarchy, that we have this sort of bureaucratic engine that's able to deal with the running of the state at a level that's so high that we get all of the relishes of a global society at all times, and like, no matter what, bananas are always in season as a result of that. And so there's a lot to recommend it, but it seems to me that it's fundamentally dishonest because it like runs on this platform of egalitarianism.
Well, I think it's been said that basically that all systems of government are oligarchies, really, when it comes down to it, that and always have been. I think that there's kind of an obvious truth to that. So, yeah, the democratic system here is obviously broken. I think even the Greeks recognized that democracy was not an ideal form of governance. And maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, but part of this does have to do with people believing what they need to believe in order to feel that they're part of a society that's worth being a part of. And quite often, whatever the ideology is that people are believing, it's not really all that well connected to reality. And in some sense, that's necessary, because reality is incredibly complex and difficult to navigate. And you just can't expect everyone to think things all the way through and come up with a rigorous perspective and debate all the fine points and do all this kind of thing, and have them going about day-to-day business and getting stuff done and feeling like they're part of a common endeavor. So every society does need to have some kind of a narrative that it embraces, and quite often it really just isn't related to the reality of what's going on. That seems like a truth as well.
I think what I'm questioning is, it doesn't seem strange to me that the notion of like a commonweal or a commonwealth is somewhat universal across time. Like, it's the government is in some sense the people's thing. It's the property that is held in common to all men. But I think what I'm getting at is that we believe, at least on the surface, we say we believe that society is a commonwealth, and that sovereignty is in the thing, the people to whom the thing is common, right? And I think I would be more comfortable with a system that is acknowledging that, yeah, the city and the government it's the people's thing. It's a republic, and in some sense, the government does serve the people fundamentally. However, that doesn't mean that that's where the sovereignty comes from. And I think this is one of the things that makes me more willing than perhaps other people that otherwise share my political views to, more or less have, an allowance for what I would call a monarchy, or even other forms of more authoritarian forms of government.
Which in some respects gets back to the communist project, because, in essence, communism is a narrative that results in totalitarianism. It's fundamentally an authoritarian structure. It's just that its path to power is on the basis of a utopian ideal of a worker's paradise.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I don't believe that the notions of and so I'll clarify my position. I believe that society is a republic. It's the people's thing, and the government serves at the pleasure of the people, so to speak. But I'm less inclined to say that sovereignty is properly situated there, because I think along with the Greeks that I fear the mob way more than I fear a tyrant. Because a tyrant who's several thousand miles away from me in the capital can only do so much to me, but the mob lives next to me.
Right.
And so I think that there's a more fundamental willingness for me to sketch out a republican form of government that has a king or a leader or a something at the top of it.
Well, I think that unfortunately it's a little more complex than that, because, you know, if the sovereign doesn't recognize the commons as their protectorate, what they're supposed to be responsible for, then they can utilize the commons, or let's say the masses, perhaps is a better term. They can utilize the masses for whatever purposes they want. And I think in some respects what we're seeing now is that the oligarchy has essentially abandoned most pretenses of caring about the masses, and that they are inclined to turn the masses against each other in a variety of different ways and to mobilize the mob. You know, that is the sense that I get quite often when I see what's happening nowadays. So unfortunately, you know, we get back to that, you know, power corrupts, and an ideal system would be one that is where governance is of the people for the people. And of course, we would recognize that when someone assumes power, they're now in some way separate from the people. So you have this unavoidable line in any kind of a political system between those who are governed and those who are governing. But I think once you get to the point where there's so much power and influence in the governors that the will of the people is no longer really considered worth much. It's basically the bread and circuses phase of political deterioration, where the people are handed representations of actual sustenance. You know, the real brick and mortar aspect of day-to-day life is in many places in this country and around the world crumbling, which is, you know, every civilization has its day. They all have a lifespan. And so the question is, how do we transition? Because there's definitely going to be a transition happening here. They're calling it the Great Reset, right? So it's something that's already been defined, and we've been hearing about it for years. For a while, they called it the New World Order. There's a variety of different ideas about who are behind it and whether or not it's well coordinated and all that kind of stuff. But clearly, there is, you know, even from our position of not having all that inside information, it's pretty clear that we are at an inflection point.
Yes. What I'm not certain about is which inflection point are we at? Because while the transition from the Republic to the Empire was pretty scary for everybody that lived in the city of Rome, it was pretty chill for everyone else in the Empire. And the outcome was actually quite good for everyone else in the Empire. In fact, Rome, the city, became less tyrannical over the provinces once the imperial age began. And so it was actually quite good, like the Pax Romana, and then all of the decentralization of power that occurs in the provinces after the rise of Augustus. It's like that's if you had to pick a century to live in that wasn't the 21st, you would probably pick the second, right? Like after 100 years of imperial rule, like it's actually not so bad.
Yeah, I mean, you had that great infrastructure without the oppression.
Precisely. And so what I'm concerned about, or what I don't know the answer to, and what I fear, is that we are not at the inflection point of the Republic to the Empire, but rather we're at the end of the Empire, and the barbarians are at the gates, and potentially what follows is not a couple hundred years of imperial glory, but a couple hundred years of Dark Age.
Right. I share that concern. I guess, if it's true that we're living in New Babylon, then the prophetic tradition suggests that the fate of Babylon is not good. And I think there's an awful lot of evidence to suggest that the Anglo-American Empire follows the Babylonian pattern pretty closely.
Then if we're closer to the fall of the empire, what was the moment in our history that was the transition from the republic to the empire?
Well, I think probably some of it had to do with going off the gold standard, the federal establishment of the Federal Reserve, where the government wasn't able to print its own money. And I think also when the United States became basically the global police post World War II, that began the long decline in our domestic affairs.
Yeah, I would have to agree there. So I guess the question is, obviously what's next for us? I mean, luckily at the fall of the Roman Empire, you had somebody like an Augustine that was able to lay the, cognitive, to borrow some words from John Vervaeke. Augustine was able to lay the foundation and a cultural cognitive grammar for a new culture after the fall of the Roman Empire. And I would say that, like, what's interesting is that it takes a while, but it takes a long while. But some of the governments that emerge in post-imperial Europe, I would say, are closest to what I would point to is, like, if I had to pick ideal forms of government, it's like, if I can't pick the Roman Empire, which is probably number one, it's like, well, 12th century France under the rule of St. Louis was pretty good too. If not from like a quality of life standpoint, at least from like the theoretical structures of the polis and the kingdom and the city, like all working together in a harmonious sort of way, like that proper balance between, the kingdom is the property of the king. The kingdom is also the public thing, and the king serves at the pleasure of the people. And the role of the king is to protect the rights of the nobles, and the job of the nobles is to protect the rights of its citizenry, right? And so you actually get, like, in the aftermath, some pretty remarkable societies that emerge. And I guess, and maybe it's too early to tell, but it's like, do the thinking ones of us, the ones that are kind of sort of publicly out there, and like we have thoughts that people are interested in, do we, what role do we play in this kind of this liminal space somewhere between the Roman Empire and, the idealized form of the kingdom of France that I've just sketched out? Like, what is our job here? Like, what's the call of duty?
I think probably it would be to see to what extent we could come to agreement on the wide range of issues at hand. To really sort of codify on some level, which would be an absolutely Herculean task. It's one thing to discuss, but it's another thing to come up with essentially a constitutional foundation, a creed, if you like, a way of going forth that we could abide by. Because fundamentally, the thing that makes a society strong is the degree to which there's an agreement, that people have a common sense of purpose, a common sense of identity. And, it's no coincidence that identity and it has been diced and sliced in so many different ways in this country, around the world, but focused a lot here. And I'm concerned that it's going to be very difficult for any region to develop enough of a common sense of purpose and identity to keep its shit together. But it seems like that would be the task at hand.
It's like the task at hand really is like a second Magna Carta, which sketches out just like in writing, like, hey, these are the rights of the people and the nobles, and don't mess with the city of London and stuff, right? It was just like it was a tacit agreement.
Yeah, it's something that would have to fit within the umbrella of the present system, whatever it's going to be. You know, I think that my gut feeling and concern is that we're going to see some rewriting of some of the basic laws of this country over the next decade, and it's not necessarily going to be a good thing. But I would say that a group that was interested in finding a way through this liminal period, let's say, kind of through the Dark Ages, would have to come to peace with whatever the empire is doing, and at the same time have its own framework for coexisting and cooperating.
And interestingly, I wonder if, and I want to use this word, but I don't want to mean it in its traditional sense. It's almost like what needs to be cultivated is a healthy sense of nationalism. Of like the thing that actually belongs to the people.
Well, that would be ideal, but you know, nation, the extent to which it could be national in scope, I think is, you know, that might be too ambitious. You know, I think that at this point our nation is just way too divided to get to the point where you could have even 10%. I'm just sort of pulling that number out of nowhere, but even 10% actually agreeing to some basic kind of document, you know.
Yeah.
I think this would be a small voluntary group. I mean, I think in some ways the real model is like the Mennonites and the Amish. You know, not specifically those models, but that they are a functional group that operates within this system, that holds together on the basis of their common understanding, common belief, and sense of purpose. And not to say that those are the particular systems that one would want to put together, but I think ideally would have to kind of fulfill those functions. And I think that scale is appropriate, given the confusion and complexity of this kind of Babylonian reality.
Yeah, precisely. When I use the word nationalism, I almost mean it more sort of like in the European sense, but subtract all of the things that we don't like about European nationalism in the 21st century. Like I mean, like the in, you know, some sense of like Brittany and itself as a nation apart from France, or Corsica and its sense as a nation as apart from France, or the Basque region of Spain.
Yeah, but look at that, because it's, you know, those are the kinds of, the Basque region, for instance, is still a somewhat contested area, and it's not, you know, they have maintained a degree of independence, but they've never really managed to gain full independence. And so I think defining it in national terms creates a problem that doesn't necessarily need to be there, because it does appear to be, at least for the time being, that the trend is towards greater consolidation and making an example of groups that are trying to be separatists. You know, look at what China's been doing. It's always a question of whether or not you're going to get increased balkanization or increased homogenization, whether they're going to be able to exert power that way or not. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that fundamentally these large, let's say, corporate-sponsored nation states are going to have way more power than any kind of an independence movement would have.
Right.
You know, and unless there's an interest in an independence movement being a proxy for one of these larger entities, you're not going to have it. And if you do end up being a proxy for that, then what an ugly situation. It's far better, if at all possible, I think, to define a relatively humble community that has a common sense of purpose and common understanding. I think fundamentally religiously structured is always the best way. And that in this period of I mean, there really is incredible aggregation of wealth and power. You know, you can't underestimate it. And really, we don't even know what they've got going on, because I'll bet most of the high level technology, whatever it is at the cutting edge, we don't even know what it is. So the capabilities, if you're going to make like some sort of a play on the global stage and you're not backed by that kind of power, then it's pointless. And so my sense is that something far more humble would be have a far greater chance of maintaining its integrity. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this discussion that we're having is so interesting, framed in like how we got here earlier, talking about the second coming and and the Word document that I sent you at the beginning of the call, because like it actually like it's almost like this conversation was scripted and we're coming to it, but it wasn't, and it's just emerging. You know, one of the things that is so interesting to me is the relationship between, well, what nation, in however loosely you want to define that, and people or folk, and however loosely you want to define that.
You know, I think originally nation was defined as common language, which is fascinating if you think of it in Babylonian terms, right? Because the whole thing about Babel is that people can't understand each other anymore.
Not a nation.
Yeah, so it has to do with finding common language.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think that there's something that is really interesting that happens in our sensibilities of the relationship between like the life that we're living today and like the future life in the Eschaton. There's a really interesting little thing that happens over the course of history, phenomenon, I guess, that happens. There's a song, obviously, in Christianity. I would assume that almost everybody's heard it. It's called "O Come, O Come, Emmanuel," and it's an ancient song. In fact, it's not even really clear when it emerges. It's perhaps 1,000 years old, at least in its infancy. And what's so fascinating about "O Come, Emmanuel" is that in the 1870s, there are two stanzas that essentially get added to this song. And the two things that get added are interesting because the structure of "O Come, Emmanuel" is that each stanza after the first stanza, which is "O Come, Emmanuel," is a reference to something that is almost fundamentally Jewish in its nature. Come, thou rod of Jesse, come, thou dayspring from on high. Come, thou key of David, come, O Adonai, or the Lord. And there's like a fundamental sort of, with the if you kind of intuit, do a little bit of psychologization on like the creators of this song, it's like they fundamentally do see themselves as remnant Israel, that the second coming is to us as the first coming was to the Jews, and you can't think them apart. And so as a result, there is a very national flavor in Christianity that lives in just the stanzas that get picked for "O Come, Emmanuel." And it should be noted that the first line of each stanza is actually being pulled from a far older tradition of antiphons that are used in various prayers, liturgical prayers in Christianity, but not very intentionally in "O Come, Emmanuel." Not all of them are chosen. We don't pick all 7 of the O antiphons. We pick just 5 of them. And then what happens in the 1870s is perhaps some universalist tendency, or, hey, we forgot about those 2, or something like that. We pull in the others and we add 2 stanzas to the end of "O Come, Emmanuel," and it's "Come, thou wisdom," and "Come, desire of nations. Bind all peoples in one heart and mind. Bid envy, strife, and quarrels cease. Fill the whole world with heaven's peace." And essentially what I see happening here is in the 1870s, at perhaps the last period of the decadence of the West before a great fall, there's this inherent recognition that the individual nations have either gone too far or ceased to be the individual nations that they are, and their differences have, in some sense, led to a sameness that can only end in strife, that can only end in total world war. And so, right at the moment when the nationalism of Europe is coming to its height, we input this, the last of the O antiphons there at the end. And I don't know if I mean this as a criticism or as a oh my goodness, like look at this, the wisdom here that's done in this fundamental act. It's like the same thing that would lead us to an embrace of nationalism is also going to lead us to a need for a desire of nations who can bind all peoples in one heart and mind. It's like in individualization, we need something universal. And I don't know precisely, how to live that. Like, I don't know, what do we do today to either, like, what's needed? Do we need 2 more stanzas to our O Come, Emmanuel? Or do we need, at this point, to strip out the 2 that were added?
Well, let's put it this way. In 1878, did those 2 stanzas prevent what was coming from happening?
No, they did not.
So, yeah, I imagine that poetry will be limited in its effect today as well, particularly because no one reads it anymore.
That's right. Hopefully God still hears it.
Amen. Well, there's one other thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to the second coming. That's it's a very bizarre point of view that's outlined by Philip K. Dick in his book Valis, which I don't even know if I recommend reading it, but I would recommend reading the end of it that has what is referred to as Cryptica Scriptura. It's like a set of short statements that are referred to throughout the body of the novel and provided in their entirety at the end. And it's a book that's very much concerned with the Logos. And it envisions, it's kind of there's a fair amount of Gnosticism mixed into it, but it's a fascinating distillation of history as this dialectic between you could say Emmanuel, who is a representation of the one who receives the Logos, and I think he refers to it as the iron prison, which is a representation of the power of the state, of the empire, and that the irony is that while the empire is always attempting to bring everything under its fold, what it ultimately ends up doing is dividing everyone up and creating a lot of antagonism. And that the receiver of the Logos is one who would actually seek to unify people, but is seen as being an enemy of the state because it undermines the authority and power of the state. And so you could view history as being essentially a dialectic between those 2 forces that have happened throughout time. And Jesus, of course, being the perhaps ultimate realization of that dialectic through history. And so the story of the second coming is that this would be the final battle between the state and the Logos, if you like. I think that in some respects, I think that's a wonderful way of viewing it. I tend to see it in those terms. And I think fundamentally, the way to think of it is that this is the will of God, that God will find that moment. And what are we to do in the meantime? Well, love God with all our hearts and minds, because we're just children. There's so much we don't understand.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Because I think, and this kind of puts the bow on everything that we've been saying, is that, we are children. We are, in some sense, the Christ story is our story. The helpless infant born in the barn. That's who we are. And despite that, there is something yet to hope for. And it's quite amazing that once you have a proper orientation to the objects of your hope, you can live any life, no matter what circumstance it happens to throw at you.
Yeah. And it's always darkest before the dawn, right? Those old cliches are really beautiful at times when you think about it. Like we were talking about the winter solstice, that's that kind of, the moment where, you're going to make it through another winter. A lot of it has to do with perspective. And I think hope and faith are what really carry us through these times, and that our actions are to a large extent irrelevant. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't study for the test.
Well, correct. The hope is actually something that makes the day-to-day bearable, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like if the object of your hope is such that, like, all of this will be redeemed, well, it's like, well, there's still all of this to attend to then, right?
Right, exactly.
And therefore the hope, which is the true hope, is the one that permeates and gives new life to every moment of the day, despite its monotony, and actually gives us something to live for, as opposed to like lesser forms of hope that would only give us something to aspire to at the denigration of life itself. And so I think to really take this all the way back to what you were discussing about the fundamental humility that lives on one side of the human dialectic between the will to existence and the will to self with a capital S, that hope is actually the way that you get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nicely said.
Because there's an acknowledgement that I'm not the fulfillment of the hope. Somebody else must be.
Right. But that doesn't mean that I can't play my role in what is to come.
Precisely. I have to play my role. I have to attend to the little things.
Yes.
Or else the object of hope won't arrive. The advent won't happen, or it won't be genuine, or it won't have the intended effect of actually saving us from ourselves.
Well, we're all participants in this grand Aquarian dance, and we have to play our part.
That we do. Well, goodness, Noah, I don't know that I can, artificially try to tie a concluding bow in that conversation any more aptly than the two of us just have done. So here, that was an incredible journey and a saga through a bunch of different, tangents that all I think do lead us and anybody who's listening to this to like something that's actually, despite any darkness, like there's a lot to look forward to, and there's a work to do. It's to embody that hope, to live it. And thanks so much for participating in this conversation and helping to tease out that little hidden wisdom that seems to be at the heart of it.
Absolutely. It was my great pleasure, Doyle. And I look forward to our next conversation whenever it may occur.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.